It's the 33rd day of the period which connects Passover, Pesach, with Shavuot. The Torah actually does not give a date, a specific date, for the Festival of Weeks, but it's pegged to 50 days after Passover. So you would establish the date by counting every single day. And the 50th day is automatically Shavuot. The truth of the matter is that that was all actually it was, the way of connecting Pesach with Shavuot, until apparently the period after the Bar Kokhba revolt. The Bar Kokhba revolt that went from 132 to 135 led such an incredible amount of devastation.
So it was much worse than the first revolt.
Yeah, much worse, much worse. And then it was accompanied by a full-out attempt to literally destroy the Jewish religion by Elias Hadrian, which in the end led to an attempt to wipe out Jewish history totally. So it's the 33rd day of the counting of the Omer, and the period of the Omer until after Bar Kokhba was pretty much neutral. After Bar Kokhba, apparently of their own, Jews started abstaining from getting married during the period between Pesach and Shavuot. The Talmud says because 24,000 students of Rabbi Akiva died during that time. Rabbi Akiva was the ideological leader of the revolt, and that these 24,000 people were likely his students, either directly or indirectly, following his lead. And the desolation was so terrible that people said, we're not going to get married during those 50 days, because it was just that evidently it was during the last push for the conquest of Judea by the Romans, which ended up in the fall of Beitar, the last stronghold of Bar Kokhba, on the 9th of Av in 135. But apparently the real push began then, and so Jews sort of said, it's so depressing, I can't get married during that time, which tells you something about collective memory, because this prohibition, which started after 135 sometime, maintained a hold on Jewish sensitivities until today, hundreds and hundreds of years afterwards. So that you see here an example of how Jews still feel, years later, the events, positive and negative events of its past.
So in the middle of the counting of 50 days, we have the 33rd day.
Yeah, the 33rd day, which is, it's a funny day. Like, why? Why the 33rd day? The 33rd day technically is when the mourning ends. In other words, you can get married on the 33rd day and get married afterwards. What happened? So here, there is absolutely no uniform idea as to why this happened. In the 13th century, there's a report of an old ancient tradition that the students of Rabbi Akiva stopped dying. In other words, something good happened on the 33rd day of the Omer, which averted the disaster, and therefore the mourning ends. Then you have those who say that maybe it's a remnant of other memories, but nobody has any idea, really. But it's stuck. It's a very, very old tradition that the mourning that Rabbi Akiva's students stopped dying on the 33rd day of the Omer, and therefore the mourning ends.
So this is a tradition from the 13th century, you said?
This tradition pops up in the 13th century. It's first attested to in writing in the 13th century, but don't forget that until relatively recently, almost many major elements and major works were passed on orally. The Talmud was not written down until 300-400 years after it was put together. The Mishnah was not written down until a couple hundred years after it was put together. The great Nordic epics that you can still go hear people in Norway and Denmark and Sweden recite at night, they're still oral. Homer couldn't write. Homer was blind. Homer basically put together the Iliad and the Odyssey. It was recited orally. So similarly, there were many traditions which were passed on from one generation to the other, and people were actually trained to remember these things by heart. And I as a historian, have a tremendous amount of respect for oral tradition, because when you have something like that, they're generally great efforts are made to preserve them in their pristine forms.
Now, what happens? How does Judaism mark this day?
So first, I have to add that the prohibition, or the negative side of the first 33 days, was confined to not getting married, and largely remained that way among Jews in Arab countries until relatively recently. Among Ashkenazim, Jews who come from France or from Germany and then migrated to Poland later on, Eastern Europe, the mourning became much more intensive. Haircuts were barred. Beard trims or shaving were barred. All kinds of other things. Having live music was barred, because this is also the period of time in which the First Crusade occurred, in which easily 10% and maybe more of Ashkenazi Jews were murdered or martyred in the course of the First Crusade in 1096. And that's why, by the way, even though technically, in terms of Bar Kokhba, the Sphira period should end with and you should get married freely after Lag B'Omer, after the 33rd day. Many Ashkenazim avoid getting married even after Lag B'Omer, because the actual dates of the attacks in the cities of Germany and actually partly Bohemia and Moravia at the time in the First Crusade happened literally in the run up to Shavuot. So you have sort of like another imposition of.
But Lag B'Omer is an exception that Ashkenazis do get married.
Yeah. So that's the whole point. So in other words, whereas Mizrahi Jews and Sephardic Jews will get married from Lag B'Omer onward, Ashkenazi Jews will get married on Lag B'Omer, and then they'll wait until like the few days before Shavuot.
So how does Mount Meron play into all this?
Okay, so this is interesting. This is another thing we don't know where it comes from. It's clearly associated with the sanctity, or the significance, I should say, of the people who are buried in Meron, who are not just Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, but others. First of all, let's start with Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was a student of Rabbi Akiva. He was a virulent supporter of Bar Kokhba. He hated Rome, just in the worst way. So he's associated very much with the rebellion. Number one. Number two, he is seen by Jewish tradition as perhaps the greatest Jewish mystic of all time, and the person to whom was revealed the Zohar. According to the Talmud and according to later traditions, he hid in a cave with his son for I think 13 years, and during that time the Zohar was revealed to him. Okay. Why was he in a cave? Because there was an arrest warrant out from the Romans. Okay. So that fits into that. But he is really seen as the authoritative figure in the Zohar and the Jewish mystical tradition. There is a very, very late tradition, 18th century, that says that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai died on Lag B'Omer, and therefore that's why they call it the Hilula of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, because you celebrate his life by celebrating the day of his death.
Okay.
It seems, however, that explanation isn't correct. It seems to be based on a misreading of that original text. That it doesn't say the day Yom Shemet Bo Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the day that he died, but rather Yom Simchat. Apparently, in the text originally it said Shin Mem, and they misread it. But nevertheless, from the 16th century, we have people going to his grave on Lag B'Omer and celebrating and stuff like that. Now, we know that earlier, even before the 16th century, during this period of time, people used to go to the Galilee on an annual pilgrimage of sacred places. They would go to Tveria, and then they would go to the traditional graves of Hillel and Shammai, which are very near the grave, the tomb of Shimon Bar Yochai. And Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was sort of added to the list. By the way, also during this period of time between sort of Pesach and Shavuot, people would visit the grave of Shmuel Hanavi, and there was it's at Nebi Samuel today. And right. According to some reports, they used to actually burn bonfires at the grave of Shmuel Hanavi.
Oh, interesting.
But this is interesting. So how did they? First of all, why they burned bonfires? Nobody knows. But what happens is, since Samuel is seen as a Muslim prophet and a Jewish prophet, also the Muslims from the 13th century, where the rulers of the Islamic world were the Mamluks, and the Mamluks were really radical supersessionists who basically said that there is no such thing as any religion except Islam, and that any saints that we know of are really Muslims, and therefore non-Muslims can't pray at sacred places. It was at that stage that Jews were barred from the Machpelah cave in Hebron and elsewhere. So the Jews were now barred from the grave of Nebi Samuel because they said it's a Muslim holy place, not a Jewish holy place. So the Jews were looking for a place. So sort of naturally, because people were going to the Galilee anyways, apparently burning the fire festival ended up moving north to the Galilee.
So has it ever been as popular as it is today?
No. It's popped up in popularity really in the last, I'd say, 120, 130 years, maybe even less. First of all, in Europe, the truth is, none less than Rabbi Moses Schreiber, Rabbi Moses Sofer, the leader of ultra-orthodox secessionist orthodoxy, thought that the whole thing was ridiculous. He says, we don't make new holidays, and I don't know anything about this, and what I hear is that people go and they hang out, and there's men and women, and it's not nice, and he has a very sharp, he's an ultra-conservative, but he's a very sharp responsum in which he says he doesn't understand what this is for. Nevertheless, we know that over the course of the past at least 100 years, it's been documented the number of people who have gone has increased to the extent that now it's hundreds of thousands of people. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, the Israeli smoke, this sort of like it'll all be fine, I don't have to worry about things like security and safety, led to tragic results last year. But the more interesting question is what is it about this day, and what is it about this figure of Shem Bar Yochai that draws so many people? In other words, you can say, I don't know, it was this and with this, but the fact that it maintained itself is a clear indication that that Lag BaOmer in general and going to Meron in particular fill a very deep and abiding need in a very large population of people, because it's not just ultra-Orthodox Ashkenazim who go. It is Mizrahi Jews, and it is Ashkenazi Jews, and it is traditional Jews, and it is religious Zionist Jews, and it's Hasidim, and it's anti-Hasidic Mitznagdik Jews, and even people who would call themselves Chiloni.
So maybe it's even the evolution of Judaism in a way. I mean, it's a religion.
Right. No, there's no question that this is a new holiday that's being developed. That's true. Mm-hmm. But it wouldn't have happened if it hadn't spoken to people. So I think you can understand it against the background of a couple of considerations. Consideration number one is that Judaism has this very strong sense. I mentioned this before in terms of Bar Kochba, of the accessibility of the past, and this idea of going on pilgrimage to the grave of a great scholar. Yes, it has a sort of a magical element to it, but it's also a question of wanting to be close to authenticity. One of the people for example, one of the, especially this time of year when schools are having their annual school trips, the whole culture of school trips and going to places that are associated with Jewish history throughout the land of Israel is associated specifically with a non-religious person. Beryl Katznelson, the great ideologue and thinker and a spiritual leader, actually, mm-hmm. of the labor movement, of the Zionist labor movement, of Mapai, of the people that ruled the country until 1977, the Ashkenazi founders. He was the one that developed this idea of going to the places where things happened in order to identify with those places and those events spiritually and existentially. So going to places where you believe great figures of the past are interred is very much part of that sort of Jewish DNA. In addition, there has been for the past, certainly in the past 30 years, 25, 30 years for sure, I think it's actually a little earlier, there is a very strong intensification not only of Jewish self-identification and Jewish identity and Jewish spirituality among the Jews of the land of the State of Israel, but it's had a very strong spiritual, almost mystical draw. You find the status of Kabbalists has sort of skyrocketed. Yes. The extensive, I won't call it a cult, but the extensive admiration for first Rav Kaduri, who was the great Iraqi Kabbalist, and in a certain sense, not so much Kabbalist, but in terms of the charisma of Jewish learning and spirituality and otherworldliness, the very extensive response of people to the death of the late Rabbi Chaim Kanievsky Zatzal, who was a person who was basically ensconced in Torah studies his whole life, but somehow exerted a tremendous hold on very broad sectors of the community, way beyond his immediate sort of surroundings. So I think like BaOmer, I think the attraction of Meron is that as well. There is a deep yearning for Jewish renewal, and I think getting back to the sources plus Kabbalism. Plus, look at I could be a detached intellectual for a minute and say, look at modernity collapsed. Rationalism, all these things have collapsed. They've collapsed into all kinds of sort of dogmatic or meta-rational kinds of systems. So sometimes sometimes they're very secular, and when modernity collapses, so very often it's happened in the past. Some mysticism comes in and fills the human need for structure and direction and meaning.